Hi everyone, my name is Jemima Abu, and today I'm going to be talking to you about state management. So I am a self-taught front-end developer and school-taught systems engineer from Lagos, Nigeria, currently working at Telesoftis in Lithuania. You can find me online everywhere at Jemima Abu. So that's LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever. That's my handle. And you can, chat with me. So let's get into it. Why do I want to give this talk? Why do I want to give this talk on state management for React applications? Because when I first started with React, I was just coming from vanilla JavaScript. And in vanilla JavaScript, if you want to change something on the DOM, you want to update a value or something, you just need to get the element by ID and update the inner text or the inner HTML. But then with React, it's like it doesn't work that way. You have to use this property called state, and you can't just change state. You have to use a property called set state. And even after doing all of that, there are still all these errors you get because sometimes set state does not work how you think it's going to work. Or basically, it was very confusing for me when I first started. I did not understand the concepts behind it, and I couldn't figure it out. And then after I finally kind of understood state, I had to move on to state management. And there were so many options. It's like I got into it and then they were like, okay, great. You want to do state management, you can use context. And I was like, context? And they were like, no, you should use Redux. I was like, so Redux is good? And they're like, no, Redux is bad. Redux is dead. This is what you should use. And I was like, I don't I don't know. I don't know what this is. There are a lot of options. So yeah, there are a lot of options. And then it was just like there were a lot of complicated concepts as well. I was just starting out and I kept on hearing all these words like reducers and providers and everything and stores. And it didn't make sense to me. I did not understand it. I did not understand how things were coming from. If I was using one state management library, I had to think in a different way than if I was using another state management library. And it was confusing. It was confusing, basically. So the reason I want to give this talk is to provide a simplified approach to state and state management in React applications. It's the kind of talk I want to give the kind of talk I would have wanted to hear when I was first starting out with states, just to understand the underlying concept. So I'm not going to focus so much on technologies. I'm not going to be listing like a bunch of state management libraries and comparing them. It's really just going to be let's say like an introductory approach to like states, the concepts of states, understanding why we need to use state management libraries in certain areas, and so on and so forth. So I hope you can learn something from it and enjoy the talk. So let's get started. What is state? What is state in React applications? We keep on hearing this word state. What does it mean? Simply put, state is the part of an application that can change. So what that means is whenever you have an application that requires things to update, basically, like you have the minute hands on the clock that need to tick every 60 seconds, or you have the a password input field that displays an error if the password is wrong, or you have a button that can display a success message, or you have a to-do list that needs to be updated and you can edit items and delete items. All these things that can be changed on the screen are referred to as states. In React, when I first started writing React, we had to use class components because functional components could not use states. They were stateless. So that means if you're writing a component as a function, you couldn't use states in it. So we had to use class components. And then in your class components, you had to define your state within your constructor. And then you could call that states in the render function using like this.state.variable. So this, I just defined my this.state name variable within my constructor in my app component. And then I'm calling it in my render function. And whenever state updates, whenever the state changes on a screen, it causes the app to re-render. For every single change of state that there is, it causes the app to render. We can see that this app has rendered 5 times because I updated the state 5 times basically. So WORLD, all that text updated the states at different intervals. So every time you call state or every time you change state, it causes the app to re-render. But then a concept we need to keep in mind is that state is immutable. Now, what does immutable mean? Immutability just means that you cannot reassign your state value. So I can't just like change my state value inside my components anyhow. Like if it was JavaScript, you could do that. You could have like your input value, for example, and you could reassign it at any point that you want, as long as no const or whatever, you could change that. But in React, you can't do that. If you want to change a state property, you have to use a method called this.setState. This.setState is basically a method that creates a new instance of the state and then assigns that new property to it. So think of it as object.assign, for example. If you're trying to create, you're trying to update an object, but you don't want to mutate the original value. Mutate means like you don't want to change the original value. You just want to create a new instance of it. That is how setState works. So you can call your this.setState within your handler methods in your class. And when I first started React, this was like so confusing to me. I was like, it's an input. Why do I need to have a function to type in an input? Like the one thing an input should be able to do is be typed into. But with React, it was like, nope, you can't even type in an input if you have a value set. It was so, it was so weird to me. But yeah, you can use this.setState to handle the changes that you need to make to your component. So for this class right here, I am calling this.setState whenever I type in my inputs, and then that updates the value of the state so that it can actually be displayed. So another concept we need to keep in mind for setting state is that setting state works asynchronously. What that means is that setting state does not change the state immediately. I'm explaining this concept because I did run into a lot of problems when I first started, because I'd be trying to change states and I'd be trying to call an effect on my new state, for example, and it would not be working how I'd want it to work. So for example, let's take a look at this code. You can see that as we're typing, it's updating on the screen. But then when you check the console log, I'm basically just console logging this.state.name. You can see that it doesn't log what we're typing. It's logging the previous state. So when I first start typing, my new state is W, but the console.log logs the previous state, which is a blank state. So now this can cause a lot of problems, especially if I'm trying to run an effect on the state.name and I'm expecting it to be updated immediately. I use set states. It's not going to work that way because set state works asynchronously. So that's why we have to use things called lifecycle methods in React, and that's a whole other thing which I'm not going to get into. But yeah, it's just something to keep in mind. So once set state is called, don't interact with the state until the next render. That pretty much means just have a lifecycle method to detect when your component has actually updated, when your component has actually re-rendered, and then you can interact with your state. Yeah, that's that concept. And now we're going to move on to the concept of local state. What is local state and how does local state work? In React, state is native to the elements it's in. Think of it as having a local variable. If you have a function and you define a variable within that function, no other function can access that variable because it's inside that function. So in React, whenever you define state in a component, that state is only existing within that component. No other component outside it can access that state. So let's say I have two components, input A and input B. Both input A and input B have state variables of name. But when I'm calling them on the screen, you can see that because I'm typing in input A, it doesn't update input B, even though they do have the same state name variables. So state is native, it's limited to the component that you listed in. And of course, that's really useful because imagine if you had like one state method, like you had one isActive method all over your React component, and then literally whenever I clicked isActive, every drop down or every menu would start toggling. That'd be ridiculous. So yes, state is local to the component it's listed in. And then we're going to go to the concept of React hooks briefly. Like I said, when I started writing React, we did not have, there were functional components, but they were stateless components. You could not define a component as a function and be able to use state into it until React hooks came out. I think it was in, what was it, 2018? That's when they announced it at ReactConf. I don't know. Anyway, so React hooks is a method that allows you use states within your functional components. So now we no longer have to use like all those class components and constructors and everything. We can literally just define our states as variables within our functional components. So how that works is that in a class method, you would have to define your state in your constructor. You'd be like, this the state is supposed to mean. In hooks, all you need to do is define your states and the action method and set it to a default variable. So let's break this down. Basically, what we have const name here is the same thing as the name variable within this dot state. Set name is the action method. So basically, think of it as set state that is native to the variable you have described. What this means is that set name is only ever going to update this naming variable here, which is very useful because if you have like multiple state instances all over your code, you don't want to have like one handler for them. So it's like one handler to one variable. You know, whenever you call set name, the value that will be updated is the name value. So the same thing when you're calling this dot set state, you're just saying set name and it's going to give you the same function. And then when you're trying to call it in the render method, instead of doing this dot state dot name, you just need to call name as a regular JavaScript variable and it'll update. So yeah, when I first started writing hooks, I was So glad because I had such a problem with class components. I just could not, like, they were fine, if you understood them, but then sometimes I'm trying to like call it this method within a function in a component, and then it's like you can't call this because this is managed the global this, so you have to be like var that equals to this, and it's just like I don't get it. So yeah, hooks were really great. Another reason why I brought hooks up in the first place is because hooks allows you to use shared state logic. So now if we think back to our input functions, we had two input components, right? Each of those components would be required to have their own handler method for updating the input. That means in one input component, you have one handler method, and in another input component, you have another handler method. What hook says is that what if you were able to abstract? I was going to say extract, and I was going to say abstract, and then abstract. What if you're able to extract the handler method for both those components and have it as like one global function that you could import in both of those components? So what I've done here is I have defined a custom hook. This was like literally the easiest way I could write this. Custom hooks, they can get complicated sometimes, but this was like the easiest way I could write this one. It is use input change. And then for when you're defining custom hooks, the proper convention is to start it with use for like React reasons. So I have used input change, and I'm calling the same methods I was calling earlier, and then I'm just returning name and then the unchanged function. So when I go to my inputs components, I can just import that custom hook I just created, use input change, and I can just set my state values to that custom hook. And it's going to allow me update it in the same way as if I had the individual handler function. So this is really great because it saves you a lot of time having to create, because I mean, thinking of handling inputs, that's something that you do a lot if you're creating like a React component that has forms, for example. So if you have to start creating handler methods for each input field, it gets a lot. So the fact that you can abstract this logic and be able to import it whenever you need it was really cool. So yeah, custom hooks, they're great. Okay, so now that is it for the concept of local state. Now we're going to go to global state. So we know that local state is state that is limited to the components. But what if we want to have a state variable that all components can access? Basically, that is the concept of global state. Global state is a state variable that can be accessed by all components regardless of what their own local states are. So to understand the concept of global state, first of all, I want to go into the concept of data flow in React. So how does data flow in React work? Data flow in React works in a unidirectional manner. That means data can be passed from parent to child to child to grandchild to great grandchild and so on and so forth. Each child can have their own states, but props can be passed down to many children. So let's take a look at this first component here. Let's say header name is our child component, and it takes a props, and the props is props.name. Our parent component is app, and then we have a state variable, a state variable name within the app. So we're passing that name to header name as props. And then we can also have like a sub component within header name, let's call it subtitle, that also takes props.name, and then we can pass that to, and then header name can also pass its props down to its own grandchildren. So basically that's how props work. You can pass props to multiple children within your React application. So if we look at this now, whenever we update states in our app.js, that state is going to be passed as props to the header name and to the subtitle component. So each of them are going to update with the application as we're updating the state. So basically this is how like global state will work. Header name and subtitle, they did not have their own states defined, but because we passed them down as props, they were able to access the changing state value. But then that's one way of handling data flow. What if we wanted to be able to change the prop in the child component itself? So this is just like basically what this code is doing here is that it's taking the props, it's setting that the state value, and it's allowing us update it from the subtitle components. The problem with this is that data doesn't always flow in one direction. One direction. Yeah, you're not going to always want to pass data from parent to child. Sometimes you may want to update the state in the child component and have it update in the parent component as well. Or sometimes you may want to pass data from a sibling component to another sibling component, which are not necessarily like inheriting from each other, And the problem you can have with that is that, so if you look through this GIF, it looks real confusing, but basically what is happening is that we are updating, the first input is updating the global state. That is the state we're passing down to header name and subtitle. The second input is updating the states for header name. So what you can see happening here is that when we update the state, it updates in header name as well. And then when we change it in subtitle, it changes in the subtitle, but it does not change in the header name. That means it does not change in the parent file. And then every time we change it in the parent file, it overrides what is already existing in the child component. So basically, this causes a lot of problems, because if you're trying to change something, let's say you're trying to log out, for example, you have an isAuthenticated function that you have defined as your global state, and now in another component you want to set isAuthenticated false basically when they log out. But now because that component is not updating your parent component, technically they are still logged in the parent component. So you can think of like how that would be confusing basically. So that is a problem that we have. And then another time is that it gets confusing keeping track of states, because sometimes you don't always need props in a particular method. But because of the way React works, you can't skip the inheritance. If let's say it's the grandchild component that needs the props, right? So I'm trying to pass from the parent components. I will still have to call those props within the child components, we just pass it to the grandchild components, because that's how inheritance works. You can't skip a level and go to the next one. So this could get really redundant, because imagine you're trying to pass a prop to a component that is like 4 levels down, and now you have to pass that prop into each subsequent component before you get to that 4th level. It's really confusing. So that's why we have the concept of state management libraries. What are state management libraries? State management libraries are tools for managing state. Who'd have thunk it? So yeah, some examples of state management libraries are Redux, Context API, MobX, Flux, and Unstated. Like I said, there are a lot of options, and it really depends on what you need it for. So state management libraries, they're basically a helpful way for helping you keep track of your states and like update it and make changes to those states, and then pass those values easily to your code without having to like deal with all of them. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm only going to be focusing on 2 management libraries, which is the Context API and Redux, which also are the only 2 management libraries I used, because yeah. So let's start with React Context. What is the React Context API? I got this from the docs, by the way, as you can tell. React Context provides a way to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level. So if we think back to that global state that we had and how data flow works, how you have to pass props to one component, another component, another component, basically what Context is saying is that you don't have to do all that. We're going to help you keep that data, and then you can just call it in whatever component you want. So how does context actually work? Let's look at how context actually works. First, you have to create your instance of context. So think of this as like creating the default value. If you want to use a context, you have to create a context. There has to be something for you to pass down to these components. So we can literally just create our context here, and then basically how I'm writing this is that, how do I put it? So it's like I have my I have my value, and I have like my callback function. So basically what my callback function is going to do is take in, I feel like this makes more sense to explain at the end, but basically this is just how I would have created a context. This should say export theme context, not theme color. So yeah, this is basically how I'd have created a context for a simple application. So now you've created your context, but how do you actually get the context to the components that need it? How do you have like a large container to keep that context in? That is when we get to the concept of a provider. Because just think of it like if somebody's telling you a story, they kind of need to provide context for it. Get it? So yeah, that's why we have a provider. The provider is something that's like kind of a global container that you can just put in your app, in your main application, like your main app.js, and then it can pass down that context to everything else. So here I have my provider. I just use my theme context. That was the file that we created earlier, and I gave it .provider, and I'm setting the value to this theme here, which is a state property. It's a whole thing. I was trying to not get into the code so much. I'm trying not to focus on the code and more on the concept. So I may not give like in-depth explanation on this. But yeah, this is basically how I'll do a theme provider for a child components. So now you've created your context and you've passed it down to your components. But what about changing the context? What about when I want to actually update this context in different places? That's called consuming content. So now because I'm working with React hooks, I can easily use the use context hook. Yeah. Well, like I think before you had to use something like a .consumer or something with class methods. Was the whole thing. But yeah, I'm working with React hooks, so this is how I would consume my context. It's with the use context hook. So we can see that in this component here, I have my local state. My local state is this name and set name. And then I have my global state, which is calling the use context, which is theme color and set theme mode. So basically what this means is that whenever I update whenever I update the theme color within this component, it's going to update for all the components. So let's take a look at a case where we have like two input components that can both control context. So now these components are meant to change the color based on the input. I'm meant to update the theme color based on the input. So we can see that when I'm typing in the first component, it's not overriding the second component per se. Well, I mean, it is, but like it's updating them uniformly. Let's say like that. It's updating them uniformly as opposed to that last GIF we had where one was overriding the other one and it wasn't like the child components could not control the parent component. Even if this is a child component and top one is a parent component, as long as both of them are using context, you will be able to update them equally. I hope that makes sense. I hope that was helpful. So yeah, that is it for context. There are certain situations where you want to use context over Redux, but I didn't have time to go into that. So I put a link at the end. I have like a list of resources at the end where you can like read up articles on knowing which to use basically. So that was it for context. And now the next thing we had to use is Redux. Redux was actually the first state management library I started using because I started using it for work. And then I was like, oh, maybe I would like, let me know more about context basically. And then I went to context. But I did first start with Redux. And Redux it was a bit complex for me. So basically from the documentation, Redux is a predictable state container for JavaScript apps. What that means is that Redux wants to work in a way that it's predictable. You know, you have an input and you do something with that input and it returns the same. It returns the expected output. So let's look at how Redux works. How does the flow of Redux work? Every time I look up how does Redux work, I always see charts like this and I can never quite grasp them. Like I get what they're saying in theory, but I can never quite understand them. So in Redux, we have things like actions, reducers, stores, providers, containers, and then components, right? So how I like to think of it, how I chose to break it down was thinking of reducers, actions, and stores in the context of an actual store. So now in Redux, take your store as an actual store. You have like a large store, a supermarket, whatever. So think of that as your initial state, as your initial store, your store container. And now the state of that store is how the properties or the goods in that store are stored. Okay, I'm going to use shop instead of store. So the state of the shop is how your goods are, basically how your goods look, the goods in the shelf or the goods that need to be unpacked or the goods that have been broken or the goods that are being sold. All of those things are states. All of those things are your state properties. Now a reducer, think of a reducer as the employee of your store. The reducer's job is to carry out actions on the states. So if I'm passing an action to a reducer, it's the reducer's job to detect what action has been passed or to detect what's like function has been passed and carry out the necessary action for it. So yeah, this was just like a little breakdown. I was going to go into some more code and then show some more explanations of all of this, but I was running out of time. So yeah, this is just a little breakdown. I do have a different a different talk I've done on Redux middleware and everything. I was going to link that at the end. I think I forgot, but I'll probably include this in a list of resources or anything. So you can go to those slides and read more if you want to understand more about how the Redux state management library works. There's all the code and everything there, and it's all very well broken down. But yeah, this is just it for basics. So another thing we need to consider when we're working with Redux is that the reducers work on the principle of functional programming. What that means is that they are pure functions. Pure functions are functions that, let's say, they work mathematically. You know, you give it an input and it always returns the same output as long as you give it the same input. So if I have 2 plus 2, or if I have like a add to function basically, and that function's only job is to add 2 to a number. For every number I'm passing, I should always expect that the result be greater than 2, right? And then Redux does not have any side effects. What that means is that it should not do anything other than returning the function, returning the output that is expected to return. You know, if I'm calling my add to function, it shouldn't also be logging things to console, you know, or making HTTP requests. It should just be doing what it's meant to do. It should be synchronous. It should work in tangent. It should work together with, like, let's say, other functions, for example. And it should be predictable because that is the entire concept of Redux. It should be predictable. Things should happen the way you think they should happen. But now the truth is, when you are working with a React application, there are a lot of side effects. A lot of times we need to set things in local storage or make asynchronous requests or pass along error messages if something goes wrong. But all these things are considered side effects in Redux. So they kind of defeat the point of using Redux as a predictable container. So how do we actually handle needing to use side effects in Redux? That's where something called middleware comes in. Middleware is basically a tool that allows you carry out side effects on an action and then pass that action to a reducer. So let's think of it this way. I have my store and then I want my employee to stock the shelves. But before the employee stocks the shelves, I want to know how many items are on the shelf. So now the employee's job, he should just have one job. That's it. He should do one thing and return one thing. He should stock the shelves and maybe return the new value of the shelves. But then before the employee stocks the shelves, let's say I want the shelves cleaned. That is a side effect. That is a side effect. That is an effect that is different from the function I'm trying to pass along. So how would I carry that out without breaking the principle of functional programming in Redux? That is when we would use a middleware function. A middleware function, think of it like an intern or something, or a temp that would come in and clean those shelves and then pass the updated shelf, which is the clean shelf, to the reducer. So now the reducer just has to actually stock it. I hope that makes sense. But like I said, I do have a slide where I go into this concept more, and I will include it somewhere later, and you guys can check that out there. So yeah, in case you want to look at some of the code I wrote for this thing, because I did have like a Git repo where I had to like write all these codes like for the functional components and the class components and the context and the Redux. You can go to github.com/jemimaabu/react-states. If you want access to the slides, you can go to my website jemimaabu.com/slides/react-states, and you'll be able to access all of those there. Like I said, I do have a list of resources in case you want to look up some more stuff. The first is just like React State Management in 2020. It's just like in case you want to know what's the latest and greatest and most popular new management library, you can go check that out. There's another link for why is set state asynchronous, basically a discussion on the Facebook, on the React GitHub page that's explaining actually why set state is asynchronous. I just thought it was cool because like I knew set state was asynchronous, but I never really knew the reason behind it because to me it just made more sense if you made set state synchronous. Like, why do I have to call it yet? But yeah, in case you want to read that, in case you're interested in it, you can check out that link. There's also state management with React hooks, no Redux or context, because sometimes people just want to use hooks, so that's the option. And then the last whatchamacallit link is to a Stack Overflow discussion on when you should use context and Redux, which is also very useful. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the talk, or I hope you learned something, or I hope you understood some of the concepts I was trying to pass across. If you have any questions, there might be a Q&A after this, I guess. But then if you have any questions you want to ask me, you can go to my website, jemimaabu.com, and fill out the form there, or you can just hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter, and I'd be glad to have a discussion with you. So yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. And I think my session is before lunch, so like, have a nice lunch. Bye.